Welcome back to Fantasy and Faith. I'm your host, Nouri Jahangir, an educator and writer of fantasy fiction. Today, my guest is Ismail Karolia. Ismail is currently studying for a creative writing PhD titled Revolution and Other Stories, The Craft of World Building in Grounded Speculative Fiction. Ismail, please tell the audience a bit more about yourself and a bit more about your PhD.
Okay, yeah. I'm a writer as well as an academic. I work in academia, but in a different area of study, really. So it's applied social sciences, where I kind of teach and do my lecturing and my research and all the rest of it. However, I've always been a writer since I was very young, so writing has always been something really central to my life. And I wanted to, my PhD is basically on the idea of world building. So the concept, the craft of world building, and how secondary worlds, these kind of fictional worlds, are created. And it's a deep look into the craft of what kind of ways are secondary worlds or fictional worlds introduced in fiction texts.
Thank you. So we've known each other for quite a bit of time because we both teach in a similar kind of field of social sciences, and I think we both taught at UCLan. I think going back about 8-9 years ago.
That's right. Yeah, we were both there. So I mean, we've kind of rotated around each other. I don't think we've ever had like a full conversation or even kind of had time together. And I didn't know you were. I actually came across the Changeling King, I think in 2011 or 12 or something like that. I think it was shortlisted or longlisted for a BBC award, if I remember correctly. I remember reading it then and thinking, oh, that's interesting, because you see the name first, don't you? And you think, oh, that's interesting. I want to check that out. Yeah, and then professionally we've worked together, but I hadn't put two and two together and realized you were the same person.
No worries. I mean, I tried to keep my two worlds separate because it kind of got confusing when people say, should I call you this or should I call you that? So when I'm writing, it's Noor Jahangir.
Yeah, yeah.
So what got you into writing?
Okay, so I suppose I've written since I was very young, very young. I'd say 6, 7, that kind of age where I think for me, reading is obviously the first the portal through which we go to kind of to get into writing. I enjoyed reading, and for me, it was a form of escapism. Something that took me away from other things, and then writing was just an extension of that. So not only could I escape into the world, I could create the world that I escape into. And I remember listening to one of your earlier podcasts, and you mentioned how a teacher had kind of praised your work, and that affirmation kind of made you want to write more. A similar experience, really. When caring adults kind of say something encouraging or supportive and affirm you, you want to then you want to do more of it. And so I wrote and wrote and wrote when I was young. And then I stopped for a long time and really didn't pursue it as I went into adulthood. I think for me, one of the things, I was brought up in the care system and I moved around a lot. And so what I remember one particular instance where I was literally I was told to kind of reduce everything I had to as small a package as possible. And I remember very clearly throwing away a bunch of short stories or, bits of writing that I'd done. And I think after that was when it stopped for a long time. Because I kind of had to, all this stuff I'd done was just, thrown away. And then I just didn't go back to it. And then as I've become older, more settled, more relaxed, and able to kind of invest myself and invest my time back into writing, I've managed to kind of get back into it. And I'd say about 4 years ago, maybe, I've kind of gone, I'm going to take this a bit more seriously. I think, like you, I've kind of, I would ideally do this as a career. I know that's a really difficult kind of thing to achieve, but, it's something that I would ideally want to happen. But I thought ultimately, I want to take myself seriously as a writer and start writing again. And so I started writing and thankfully had some initial success. So kind of placed in competitions and things like that, which was really, again, very affirming for me and kind of made me realize, I can do this. I did try and write a novel, and it's really, I don't know how you guys do it. It's really hard just to kind of can keep that consistent level of writing across such a large, long piece of work. I don't know how you guys do it. So I'm in awe of you, really. But yeah, coming back to writing, I've kind of focused on the short story because I found that kind of compact form more within my abilities in terms of being able to really develop, characters and plot and ideas and the ideas I want to develop. So I'm focusing on the short story now at the moment, and hoping to kind of through my PhD write a collection, create a collection of short stories, mainly in that kind of grounded speculative fiction genre. And yeah, and I suppose that the PhD for me is a bit of an avenue really to kind of develop my writing, because of that large gap. I don't think for me personally, I've kind of had that kind of sense that I'm not I'm a good writer, but I'm not at the level I need to be a publisher. I can put words together, I can create scenes, I can create characters and all of those things, but the it doesn't have that refinement that's needed. And so for me, the PhD is the education side of it as well, almost like kind of really internally focusing on myself and my craft and developing my craft.
I mean, you've given me quite a lot there to unpick.
Sorry.
Um, that's okay. That's okay. So one of my early inspirations, I mean, I've talked a bit about my early childhood, how my teacher reading Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the trigger moment for me. It's like, okay, this is something that I want to do as well. But when I was a teen, I was already writing, and I tend to write long form rather than form fiction. I think I've always been a bit rubbish at short form, and I think Brandon Sanderson said that you either if you write long form, write long form. If you like short form, write short form. Um, you're going to be better at one than the other.
Mm,
So I was trying to write long form and short form as a teenager, and even though my father didn't get it, he's like there's no money to be made in writing. Even if you go into journalism, there's not much money in journalism either. But he still supported it. He put me on. I wanted to do a distance learning course called the Writing School,
mhm.
which was about 120, and then in the 90s, 120 pound for a man
Not
working,
money.
yeah, working man. It's a lot of money, right?
Mhm,
But he coughed up and he allowed me to do that, and then he went and bought me a word processor. And if you've seen the Adrian Tchaikovsky video, you'll have heard of how awkward those word processors were. But
mhm.
again, it was another £100, and he paid it, even though he wasn't seeing much of a return from it. So for me, having my father supporting my writing in that way was important, I think, for my development. You say you came up through the care system. Did you have somebody, an adult, who was supportive of your writing at that time?
I did. I mean, obviously, one of the things of being in the care system is, for many people in the care system, it's quite chaotic. So I had my elder sisters who were really fantastic in trying to support me to do that. But I suppose within the care system, everything's quite temporary. So, things start and things disappear. And then, in a sense, writing was like that as well. So I was writing, and then suddenly all this stuff that I was really proud of. I mean, I remember you mentioning kind of, the teacher reading and that being, central to you. I remember one time writing a short story. I think I must have been 11 or 12 years old, and it was quite a dark short story for an 11 or 12-year-old to write. It was about a young woman who runs away from home, gets involved in an illicit relationship, and gets involved with drugs and all that kind of stuff, and ends up killing the person, killing someone. And my English teacher loved it, and she read it out in class to the whole class, and that was like wow to me, like wow, she's loved it. She told me she shared it with the other teachers. Probably completely inappropriate for a child of that age to be writing, but contextual in terms of the stuff I was exposed to and things like that. So it's but so that kind of pride I had around my writing was also temporary. But yeah, I had, so I had things like, um, often English teachers. So I can't remember his name, but Mrs. Brown was the one who read it from the class. There was another teacher, Mr. Shepherd, I think his name was, who, I'd written a book basically based on the Demon Headmaster. I don't know if you remember that book, but on that kind of an idea. And this was when I was slightly younger, and he put it in the, he got it printed out and put it in the library and things like that. And those were all things which made me go, oh, I can do this. I can do this. I'm good at this. And yeah, I think that those experiences really did, that encouragement is needed oftentimes. But like I say, I think it was kind of bitty and all, like I say, temporary. It wasn't kind of um, and when I stopped, nobody noticed, if that makes sense. There was no one there to kind of go, "Oh, you've stopped doing that now. What's going on? Why are you carrying on with it? Why don't you look at this? Why do you look at that?" And so, in a sense, I didn't have that necessarily, that guidance, or that sense that this is something I could pursue. And I suppose that translates to when I was going to university, for example. Initially, I went for a business degree, to do a business degree, and then realized I just didn't enjoy it at all. And then my second option was an English degree. So I hadn't even thought of a creative writing degree, which were around at the time, and I could have taken and all the rest of it. I was like, no, I'll do an English degree. Um, but yeah, so it's those kinds of things, but not necessarily having the guidance or the people to kind of point you in the right direction for it can make a big difference in terms of what you end up doing.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to all those teachers, Mrs. Brown and Mr. Shepherd. I mean, I had a whole bunch of teachers. For instance, Mrs. Bracewell was the one who read Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, so she's the genesis moment for me. But then there was Mrs. Bridget in primary school who read out, well, picked up on my review of Paddle to the Sea, and then made a big deal of it, and then the school made a big deal of it. And then Mr. Hodgkinson was my final um, teacher in primary school who liked my short stories. He liked horror, so I was trying to impress him with more horror stories. So he made a show of like appreciating that. But then when I went into, because I didn't go to a normal secondary school, I went to a Dar Uloom, and we had teachers there. So I mean, writing isn't really kind of writing fiction, anyways, isn't really that appreciated in the madrasa system. But Mona Yusuf Kara was one of my early English teachers, and he would read my work and say, "Well, where are you coming with these words? Are they even like real words, or like these some archaic terms like raiment for clothing?" So he would go out, ask the GCSE English teacher, and at one point the GCSE English teacher called me over to his class, um, and apparently Mona Yusuf Kara had taken over my book, and his name was Mr. Ibrahim. He was a revert Muslim, and he read out my entire story to the 50s. They were doing their GCSE English that year. And they look at me like, who is this kid? Like a 12, 13-year-old kid. And uh, the teacher's reading out a story by this kid. And then he said to them, if you want to get a grade A in your GCSEs, you got to write like this guy. And they all turned to me like, ooh, like, what? Who is this kid? And they all came after me after class. And I was scared. I thought they were going to jump me. But they're like, well, where did you copy it from? Did you like borrow it from some other story? Is it like copied and pasted in? I mean, back then we didn't have copy and paste; it was handwritten. Um, but they were like kind of shocked that I could write at that level. So Mr. Ibrahim was very supportive. But then we had a science teacher who had access to the computers, and he saw my writing, and he was like, "Okay, you can come in here, use the computers, write your stories." So in the times like between classes, when I had a free period, I would go in there. He would let me in and work on it. And he's the one who told me I should do a degree in English to further my knowledge and experience. So that was the prompt for me. So definitely a shout out to teachers.
I was going to say are so important, aren't they? And for me, it's not only the people who got us writing, but the people who got us reading. And for me, it was my elder sisters who did that. It was like my two elder sisters, Miriam and Hamida, who and I always wonder, just thinking about the context of how the homes in which we grew up in and all the rest of it, why they were so keen on reading. Maybe it was the same thing. It was just a form of escapism. But then as a family, we tend to all read. We all tend to be readers, which is great for for kids coming from care system because it's an avenue to education. It's one way to be able to excel and develop in education, so you can then get you can we came up from in inner city Bradford in the care system, so all the kind of everything stacked against you really. So but the reading was probably for many of us our savior and the route way into to writing. I don't think there's many writers who didn't start with reading, and sometimes it's the people who open reading up to you first that kind of really set you off on that journey. Oh, so yeah, obviously the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the whole series. Absolutely loved it. The there was certain books that definitely stood out. Judy Blume's Fudge series. I don't know if they're familiar to you at all, but I was obsessed with them as a child. And what else? I was thinking about this because I knew you were going to ask this question. The I think when you especially when you're an avid reader, you read everything, don't you? In those days, we used to read cereal boxes. There used to be things on everything that you could just read, and I suppose nowadays, because there's so much on our phones, and we're ending up reading, we just end up reading so much. I think we read more than we have ever done previously as a society, but we don't retain any of it, and we don't really engage with it in the same way. Um, in those days, yeah, definitely in the 90s, it was more kind of just read everything that you could get hold of. I remember a book I read once, which was around um, it was like projection, a story about two young people who could astral project and go into a different plane and all those kind of things. And these are really important things. I can't remember the name of that book or the title of it, but they were fantastic. They took me into another world. They allowed me to kind of exist in someone else's experience. Uh, I think Fudge was really important because this kind of normal family setup. For me, that was the greatest escapism. The idea of just this is how a normal family works, and this is how it all kind of looks. The relationships and all the rest of it. That was really really impactful for me. Um, so yeah, just read widely, and my elder sister Hamida used to always take us to the library quite regularly. So we'd kind of get a new book and try something different. And oftentimes I'd go off the cover and just does this look like something I would enjoy? And yeah, and kind of go into. And I wasn't a sci-fi reader. Obviously I'm mainly writing about SF now, and most of my writing is SF. But I used to read much more broadly. I didn't really define what I just read anything that looked interesting. Horror, point horror. I don't remember if you remember the point horror books that were out back in those days. Those kinds of things. I still really enjoy reading those as well.
Yeah. So, how much of your sister's tastes in fiction guided what you were reading?
I'd say, yeah, not much at all. For them, it was probably more at that age. It was things like Enid Blyton and other things, and I didn't read any of that. I never got into it. So yeah, I don't think much at all really. But it was just the idea of um, sitting on your bed reading a book or reading before bedtime or going to the library, picking up a book. All of that, all of those kind of activities became so normalized that that's what you just did. And like I say, for me specifically, it was definitely just a form of escapism. It was something that I just enjoyed doing. But yeah, I don't think their taste really informed anything that I did.
Yeah, another shout out to elder siblings. My
Mm.
big brother was a guiding light or guiding darkness. I don't, in my choices of reading. So he read the famous five, and he'd bring them, and I'd read them. And then he discovered a writer called David Gemmell,
Hmm.
is known as the king of British heroic fantasy. So he started bringing those home, and I'd read those. And I was reading way ahead of my age group, and there wasn't such anything. for young adults at that time. So the YA fiction didn't exist. It was children's fiction and then adult fiction. So I moved into reading that stuff when I was about 9, 10 years old. So my big brother had a massive influence on the kind of stuff that I was reading, and then I had same influence of my younger brothers on what they were reading. It kind of guides you in. So I don't think there was any other thing that I would have gone into other than fantasy because of that.
Mm.
Let's talk a bit more about your writing now. So you say you write science fiction, speculative fiction, I think you used in your transfer. Um, and in your transfer, you talk about different definitions of speculative fiction. Explain a bit for the audience. What do you mean when you say speculative fiction?
Okay, so there's a huge discussion around genre, taxonomy, and on all those kinds of things. So we have these terms: science fiction, speculative fiction. The way I define it is speculative fiction, and others do as well. Is speculative fiction is almost an umbrella term, an umbrella under which sits things like fantasy, science fiction, horror. Anything that is strange and different and is discontinuous from the real world. The idea that this is very different to the real world, and has noticeable differences. So that's how I define it. But others define it differently. So, for example, Atwood very famously argues that speculative fiction is it's a genre on its own, and science fiction is very separate. And speculative fiction is something that she would argue that it's something that it's a genre in which things happen that could happen, whereas science fiction is more fantastical. So she kind of has that definition, which I understand. I don't necessarily agree with, but I understand where she's coming from. And famously, her and Ursula Le Guin had a great kind of discussion around this and a back and forth in books actually that I've got, that in terms of their definitions around that. But as I define it, speculative fiction is that umbrella term, with those genres underneath it, and there are similarities in fantasy and science fiction. Now, I don't actually read much fantasy. I've read Lord of the Rings. I've read Raymond Faced Magician, and those kind of series, and Philip Pullman. So I've read some of them. I can't say I'm well read in the genre, but I've read some of the key texts, and I don't write fantasy at all. But the similarities are, in those genres, is obviously is the world building. The idea that something in the world is very different, typically, to the world that we live in now, and so it's that that's the connecting tissue really between those different genres that allow them to sit under that umbrella. And the idea of being speculative, is asking what if, speculating what would happen if. And so, what would happen if there's something different in the world? And essentially that's why they all sit under that umbrella. My particular writing is in, if you think of it like a spectrum, Mark Wolf kind of talks about this idea of like a spectrum of, how far away from the real world a piece of fiction is. So, and this is where Veronica Roth comes up with this term, grounded science fiction. So stuff that's closer to the real world is kind of grounded speculative fiction, whereas stuff that's further away is the more fantastical. So something like Star Wars is really far away, but something like The Handmaid's Tale, for example, might be closer, or On the Beach by Neville Shute. So these are so those kinds of I kind of focus on those worlds that are closer to the real world. So I tend to write stuff that's not overly fantastical, that's much closer to the real world, and so that's kind of things like near future, alternative histories, things like that, where you recognize the world a lot more.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is Man in a High Castle.
Yeah.
Yeah, where one thing's changed. The Germans won World War II. How has that changed the world? How has that affected life in America? But San Francisco is now under control of the Japanese. The East Coast is under the control of the Germans. So how is the world different like that? So that's, I think, a good example of changing that one thing.
Mm.
And other than that, there's not that much science fiction in there, but if I think it falls under science fiction bracket. Okay, so your book, your story, Nuke, which I like the play on the title, um, follows a child who's experiencing World War III, I'm guessing. Um, so how have you managed to ground that in reality by using what we call an unreliable um, protagonist or unreliable point of view because the child doesn't fully understand what's going on? How does that help or limit how you tell that story?
Yeah, so the Nook follows, a child and his family escaping an act of war, and it's one of those where if someone ever was to read it, I don't want to give too much away in case it spoils it for them. But yeah, it's a devastating situation. This family has kind of experiencing an act of war and is fleeing from this situation. And it's a child protagonist, a young child, probably around the age of 5 or 6. And to try and keep true to that child's point of view, I tried to show the confusion that might be happening in that situation. Now, even adults, if something was to happen, to us, we would be confused and try and work out what's going on and all the rest of it. We would have something to fall upon in terms of knowledge, previous knowledge to be able to call on to consider what it might be, what might have happened. But this child doesn't know what the weapon is that's being used, and even though it's a weapon of mass destruction, they're imagining it as some kind of shadow and some kind of with spider legs that's running towards them. They have this imagination of what it might be because adults are using these words, but the child doesn't understand them, isn't able to kind of really define them. And so the child's point of view. I think when I reanalyzed the story, I realized that actually there's very little world building in there. There's very little information given in there, and the child just explains things as they see them or feel them, or what he feels or what he sees. And as a reader, we're actually we're creating the world building in reading it because we infer what's happening, and we can make assumptions about what's happening and what the protagonist is going through. So yeah, for me it was a little bit of a trick in a sense. I didn't realize I was doing it at the time, but I suppose when I kind of look over it again, um, and especially with my interest being in how worlds are created in how fictional worlds are created in fiction, um, in that particular story, it is actually about not telling the reader what's going on and just allowing enough clues that the reader can kind of work out what's happening. And I don't think I've met anyone yet who hasn't worked out what's happening. But it's a case of the world being built through the reader's mind rather than on the text of the page. And I thought that was an interesting kind of way of creating a secondary world, a fictional world.
It's a risky strategy, isn't it? Relying on the reader to be able to fill in those gaps. I mean, my style of writing, I tend to favor broad strokes, so not provide every bit of detail in the scene, just enough so that they get kind of an image in their head, and then allow them to fill out things. So I might not even discuss the colors around them. I might just say, okay, this grass, assuming everybody knows grass is going to be green. Um, the wearing a red jacket. So what does that jacket look like? Is it important? Is it going to add to the story? So you kind of just provide broad strokes. But how do you feel like it's risky doing that because it's assuming quite a lot on behalf of the reader that they will be able to um, from what you've put on the page to draw out certain details and fill in those gaps. What if, so for instance, people with neurodiversity,
Mm.
if they read it, would they be able to? capture those things and fill in those gaps as well. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think there's two things. One, as a writer, you're always, particularly in speculative fiction, but in all fiction, there's always a level of which you're throwing something out and you're allowing the reader to create, the images of what's going on there and figure out what's happening. We don't want to be, as you will know, kind of all the writing craft kind of advice is always to never tell everything, as it is. It's allowing the reader to be a detective and to work things out as they're going along. This is taking that, I suppose, a step further, but it's done in such a way that I think most people will. And if they didn't, it wouldn't. I don't think it would matter if they didn't figure out the little clues of what the weapon was or what exactly is happening. They would still be. They would still understand that there's, for example, something really bad has happened. This family is fleeing this, and they're on essentially a quest for freedom, a quest to escape this terrible situation. And they would be able to follow that story with, I think, almost as much satisfaction as the person who figures everything out, if that makes sense. So I think there's the balance between trusting your reader but also ensuring that if your reader doesn't get it, that they still get something out of it. And the Nook was, I know you've had Farhana Sheikh on previously as well, and this actually was placed as highly commended in last year's Leicester Short Story Prize. Which I was really pleased at, and I think it was Iqbal Hussain who was one of the judges who said, it's just a barrage of action, the story, and in a sense that is exactly what it is. It's a barrage of action. There's things happening after one after the other, but so in that sense, it's an action story almost, But at the same time, there's this underlying thing of working out what's happening with the child and what they're seeing and interpreting what they're seeing into the and identifying what's exactly happening. But the other thing is that it is a child's point of view, and for me, it was really important to keep true as possible, which is in itself a whole discussion and a really difficult thing to do. Keeping true to the child's point of view, trying to keep the language simple as a child would use. All of those elements of it were also important, like making sure that I didn't kind of for the sake of information kind of swerve from keeping to that child protagonist's point of view.
Okay. So, in your transfer, again, you talk about Suvin's concept of novum, the strange new element that makes it speculative. How important is balancing the novum with real world stuff? So, for instance, like world data, culture, politics, religion, which is an important part of what this channel is about, um, and social behavior under stress. So, how much? I mean, I mean, I understand it from my perspective, but we'll hear you out first. But how do you balance bringing in that new fictional element with trying to maintain that reality of the primary world?
Yeah, so I think you've got those different elements. So the Novum initially was kind of talked about as a new technology, but it can be across a range of things: a new societal structure, a new circumstance where existing technology is used in a different way. There's there's a number of things that it could be across the kind of across the range of things that you could change to be different to the primary world. The balancing of that is dependent upon kind of how much you're changing. So I think the novum is the central change, that the key thing that is most significant to your plot, to your characters, to the world that you're creating. But within that, you might be creating a multitude of other changes in that society or in that world. So there might be other things that are going on. So you might have, FTL travel or other things going on in that world, which are not necessarily they're not the central point of change, and the central thing that is more significant. But they are also other things that are different within that world. If you take something like the Hunger Games, for example, as a kind of a popular some kind of popular text that people know about, or the films. The games are the novum. The games are the central key thing that is what is significantly different. But all of the rest of the world, the political system, all of those other changes, even the food and everything else, and how it's produced, and all of that are other changes that contribute to that world. And so, for me, it's about kind of focusing on the novum is often the thing you put the most effort in your writing. Again, in the Nook, it's probably not. So you can always break rules. Rules are there to be broken. In the Nook, the novum is not the thing that is focused on most. It's the journey and the feelings and the experiences of the family. But in most instances, the novum is the thing that's concentrated a lot, and the thing that needs most explaining. So requires most explaining. And I suppose my interest is always in how you explain that. So the different ways in which the fictional world is exposed and explained to the reader, and then how you ground the reader into that fictional world. And so, it's looking at the different ways in which you can do that. For example, through an unknowledgeable character who doesn't know about the world and needs to explain it to them, or through an education system, or through through just plain old exposition and just telling them this is why this is like this. So there's all these different ways in which we can kind of explain those worlds. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's
It kind of does. Yeah. So when I was doing my doctorate, I did it as a ethnographic style um, qualitative research. And in ethnography, they say that you have to try to look at the familiar thing through unfamiliar eyes. So, for I mean, you read The Changeling King. So, in The Changeling King, I have it's kind of a portal fantasy. I've got um, human teenagers going from this world into another world. So, the challenge there is to make the strange new world familiar through their eyes. So things that would be fantastical take on a mundane kind of element. But on the flip side, I have Vash is a troll, and he's taken a squad of trolls to our world, and to make our world seem alien because we're viewing it through their eyes. So it's that concept of shifting the perspective based on the viewpoint character rather than on our viewpoint. So for me, the more fantastical this novum is, the more realistic everything else needs to be. People always say, "Well, you're writing fantasy, so you can just make up whatever you want, and it's fine. You don't have to worry about reality." But I would argue that we have to work even harder at making things real. So, for instance, if you've got a tree that's don't have branches but just mushrooms growing out of it, I would then go and study fungus that grows on trees, and what is the relationship between the two? Uh, how does it happen? So that I could um, fully flesh out why that tree is the way it is, um, and not have somebody point out and say, "Well, that's just some random thing that you've done." I said, "No, actually, it has basis in reality."
mm,
The way physics works. So you could argue in the fantasy world, you can just bounce around and fly around like you're on the moon, but physics has to work the way it does for us because you don't want to spend time trying to explain uh, why aren't people flying off into space with one single bound like Superman. Um, so we have to rely on the reader to accept that the normal rules of the world apply here. There's just a few things in this secondary world that are different to
mm,
our primary world. So, for instance, in one of my works in progress, um, a kind of a, I'd say not quite ancient, but pastoral Arab tribes before we had Mecca, Medina, go through a portal into a new world, and they find animals there that are similar to the animals in our own world. So there's large canines and large felines out there are similar enough to tigers and wolves that I'm not going to waste time explaining that this is what they look like. This is what they do, and this is what the fangs do. So I'm assuming that they know how a lion or a tiger works, and they know how a wolf works. So I said they're wolf-like animals. Maybe I'll point out what makes them different to um, earth wolves and earth lions and tigers, but just again, brief outline of that so that they already understand that yes, this is another world, but the rules are pretty much the same. The animals are similar to the animals that we have. Otherwise, it would be, why is this a rock? You know, what have you come up with that's unique to this rock on this new world? Why, what do the trees look like on this world? They look like trees. What does the grass look like? It looks like grass. What does the sky look like? It looks like the sky here. So I think the more fantastical you want the novum or the new idea to be, the more you have to ground the rest of the story in what we would consider reality. So that's my take on the
Yeah.
novum and balancing it with reality.
I think that reminds me of when you had that. There's that famous piece of anthropological writing, which is it's describing the Americans, but it's doing it in such a way. So, like, they use these sticks to grind at their teeth, and it's talking about brushing their teeth, but it's written in such a way that it's making it more primordial and all the rest of it. So that kind of that fresh eyes thing is really important. I know Frederick Jameson. He writes on sci-fi, and he talks about how sci-fi is either usually, and I think this is true of fantasy as well. It's either extrapolation or analogy. So it's extrapolating what might happen, or what could happen if this technology, or it's an analogy to the real world, to the society that we're living in, and things like that. And so you're kind of constantly you're deciding which way you're going here in terms of thinking about the work and what you're trying to talk about. Whether you're in one or the other really, but yeah, it's trying to make sense of the real world. I think science fiction does that more than anything else in terms of it's making sense of the real world through these other worlds, so that we can kind of make sense of what's going on in society now.
Sticking with this theme, so would you describe Nook as a near future story rather than set in the present with that alternative reality?
So I would, yeah, I would have, I would define it as a near future story. So I say this. So this is a Muslim family in an ostensibly Muslim community who are suffering this attack, and I wrote this when I started writing. It was a few years ago. I think it reads differently now with things that are going on in Palestine, and you know, in that sense, you kind of. But I suppose, in a sense, for me, taking that idea of extrapolation, the I know growing up, there's always this fear of kind of Muslim world and Muslim communities being, you know, and we've seen examples of it previously, obviously Iraq and Afghanistan in recent history. So the sense that weapons of mass destruction can be used in those spaces is is something that's central to it. At the same time, I don't define the place, and this is, I suppose, one of the interesting things. So one of the readers that has one of the people who've read it has said, she feels it's in the north of England. This is set in the north of England, and the reason it's called the Nook is because that's a northern way of saying Nook. So Nook. So there's different readings of it, and I also like that. I knew you mentioned earlier talking about the Nook. This could be World War III or the beginning of World War III or during World War III. Again, it's a reading, and I love that kind of, as a writer. I love when other people have various readings of the same work. It's almost like, wow, you've created a new story from the story that I've created.
And I think that's the strength of the Nook is that it could be set anywhere
Mm.
and be relevant to anyone. But I think the risk of writing near future fantasy or near future science fiction is that reality can overtake the fiction. So, for instance, Back to the Future 2, set in, is it 2020 or 2019 or something,
Hmm.
with the flying cars and everything else. And we're living in those times, and in some ways, we got technology that far outstrips anything that people have imagined with the smartphone, for instance. And at the same time, we're still not got the flying cars, right? We still don't have the floating hoverboards and things like that, or the trainers that automatically fit your foot once you press the button. Um, so, what is the risk of that happening, and does that destroy the relevance of that work?
I think we the pace at which technology is developing has been developing for the last I'd say 15 years or so. So now we have this AI boom, and we have a rapidly changing every few months. There's new things coming out and new things you can do. And people are writing it. Over the last few years, definitely there's been an increase in people writing around AI and what that might look like, and it's constantly being overtaken by the reality of the situation. Um, I think there's a few things there. One, it does risk that it becomes relegated because of its currency and its lack of kind of fitting with what actually happens. But science fiction is not prediction, and it is not. It's not trying to say this is how the world is, or this is how the world is going to be. It's not prophecy. It's nothing. It's nothing like that. It is, like I say, extrapolation or analogy. It's a think of it's a kind of sense of saying, extrapolating what might happen and what are definitely, whether it's utopian or dystopian. These are some of the eventualities that might occur because of this technology or this thing that's happening. Always an analogy, and the themes of it are really important. The themes that is trying to explore in AI are kind of are current, and the things that we're feeling. So a great example of this is something like Black Mirror, Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror, where all of these kind of, quite a lot of them are near future or grounded fiction kind of stories in that series. And it's not about how accurate it is, but it's about the feeling that we get from I think there's one around social media and kind of points that you get, how many likes you get and stuff like that. And that sense that becomes central to society and how society functions and runs. And if you fall from grace, how difficult that will make your life. Those stories are something that people feel and understand the themes of. And so it's not about how accurate it is, but it's about reflecting kind of what's going on in society at this moment in time, and what are some of our fears. And if you're tapping into them, or hopes as well, our fears or hopes and or hopes. If we're tapping into those things through science fiction, it's often, it can often live beyond. So I still watch Back to the Future 2, even though I know it's completely wrong. I also watched 2001, A Space Odyssey, but knowing that hasn't happened. But but because they're great films, and because of the themes that they talk about are either universal or specific to the fears of kind of the time.
Do you think one of the fun bits of writing science fiction is playing a little bit of futurism, of trying to predict what might happen? I mean, 1984, George Orwell. I mean, pretty much everything George Orwell writes, even though he's writing about the times that he's living in at the moment. Um, when you look at 1984, it kind of captures a lot what's been happening in Britain during the mid 2010s, with Boris Johnson being in power, and with Donald Trump back in power again. So a lot of the themes around politics and culture and societal norms um, kind of make 1984 relevant all over again. Same with Animal Farm as well. The themes in that, when you look at the situation today, you think, well, George Orwell was writing about our times, not his own times.
Mm.
And same can be said of other fiction like that, where they kind of um, have guessed about what things will be like, and then things have happened as a result. I think William Gibson's Neuromancer kind of predicted meta. the kind of a third space of virtual worlds, which people want to spend more of the time rather than reality. So I think part of the fun for me, I mean, one of my short stories that was published, I haven't written that many, but I wrote one, was about a proto-consumer where consumption has become their entire life, and is to the point where the female protagonist in there becomes unaware of her actual reality. There's nanorobots looking after her. Um, she's being fed intravenously, um, and her entire job is to stay in that position to keep consuming whatever products are being sent, and she's automatically being billed. So for me, it's like how much of this will become reality, like having little nano machines inside your um, body doing the healing and everything. Um, so that's my spin on it.
Yeah.
So for you, I mean, go on, go on.
Okay. I was going to say, and how far are we from that reality in terms of our phones are consumer machines now, and they're becoming increasingly consumer machines, and we can just sit there all day and kind of consume content, but also buy stuff and constantly sold stuff, and the way certain apps are based around almost using gaming and gambling to help us to buy stuff and make us buy stuff. you know yeah, so you've extrapolated from that and kind of taken it to the, and sometimes that's what science fiction is doing, is taking a modern kind of issue and taking it to the nth degree to see what would that look like at its most extreme. But it's the themes, so why is George Orwell still read, and why do people still feel he's relevant, is because the themes are somewhat universal. They're about power, they're about politics, they're about so even though we're not seeing the party as it operates and Big Brother as it operates in 1984, what we are seeing is surveillance. We're seeing, even in some cases, the counter. So we had Donald Trump recently rename the Department of Defense to the Department of War. So famously in 1984, the departments are the opposite of what they do. So the Department of Peace for the Department of War, and all the rest of it. So we've had like almost a reversal of that, but it's still commenting on that whole what's going on now. We can still take something from that novel about the politics of the current world, and power, and how it's being used to oppress the general public.
Even going back to after 9/11, 7/7, um, the way that we were almost being policed for our thoughts as well.
Mm.
Anything that we said or wrote down, there would be a case of second guessing. What are they saying? What is this hidden meaning here? Even when we were just trying to be open. So it got to the point where, I mean, you might remember this yourself as well, where you'd be very careful of how you speak on the phone, what words you use, um, having public conversations. I can remember the imams were really concerned with how might what we say in a Friday sermon be misconstrued by somebody, or how it might um, affect our relationships in the community. We were sending out. I was working in a charity that worked with mosques at that time. We were sending out guidance on what to talk about, what not to talk about, how to deal with sensitive issues. And that shouldn't have been a thing, but it became a thing because of the politics of the time of trying to police what people are thinking and saying, which is what George Orwell's 1984 is about.
But and right now, we can say that was then, but right now there are people who have very legitimate arguments or concerns, and if they're expressing them, they are arrested immediately on the spot. So in some of the protests that are going on, we're seeing that real clampdown on people who have a genuine concern, or kind of query, or they want to question something that's happening in our society. And they might be elderly, they might be frail, they might be disabled, but they're getting arrested on the spot, taken into. So yeah, we're seeing some of that stuff, and what those novels of old, and more recent ones, because there are, American War's a good one. There's other books that, I'm just reading at the moment. The Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which is based on an island which is going through this process of becoming more authoritarian, and so this is a real fear, but it's actually playing out in front of us, and we're seeing probably the most uh, one of the scariest times I've ever experienced in my 4 years, definitely in terms of politically and society. So, and science fiction allows us to kind of explore those themes in the safety, I suppose, of making it otherworldly. We have that opportunity to go, this isn't happening, but this is what could happen, or this is how bad it can get, and hopefully allowing other people to question what's going on around them and consider, whether that's what they want to do. I mean, obviously, Orwell famously was fighting in the Spanish War, so he had that experience of authoritarianism and fascism, and these are, it comes from our experiences. We kind of can reflect them onto the page in fictional worlds.
And coming back to the world building, how important is world building to you? Is it more important than character or plot, or is the world building just in service of the plot?
I think it's what demarcates, those genres from from kind of your realist fiction. I also write social realism as well, so I kind of have a hand in that camp and write other stuff as well. But world building as a separates that genre, but it's central to that genre. Whereas the plot and character is universal, you need to have that in pretty much any text that you read, or any fiction that you read. So but ideally, these things should all work in tandem. You can have a fantastic world, but with poor character building or poor plotting, it won't necessarily be fantastically interesting, and won't expose kind of what you want it to expose. But so those things should all be done in tandem. For me, one of the key things is how we then expose that world. So I use, in my PhD, I use a guy called Mike Clarkson kind of did a thing where he broke up the kind of types of text that we use, types of modes that we use, the writing modes that we use, into different elements, into units. And so these are things like sensation, emotion, introspection. I'm going to read some of them because I can't remember. Action, narrative, exposition. These are different ways that we can do it, and through dialogue. We can do things through dialogue, through action, through wherever it might be. And so, how are we actually explaining this world? How are we showing off this world? Going back a long way, I remember a film, you may remember it, called Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone. And there's it's a story. Sorry, yeah, Wesley Snipes. Yeah, it's a film about a kind of a cryogenically frozen police officer who gets reawakened in the future, and he has to sort out these societal issues and things like that. Anyway, there's a scene in there where he goes to in the future. He goes to pay for something, and they just ask him to scan his thumb. And in the 90s, this was like, wow, this is so futuristic. I mean, we do this nowadays, don't we? But it's such a little thing. We didn't have to explain it. He just went and put his thumb on the scanner, and it scanned, and that's how his payment was made. These are really interesting for me. That's the sense that kind of how you create that wider world without having to explain everything, just by kind of showing certain things, and it goes back to that discussion of showing and telling. And oftentimes when we think about world building, we think more about telling, where especially in the olden days, people like Tolkien and stuff would just describe stuff and tell us what's going on, and all, and that was kind of how it was done. You're exposed to the world by large bits of info dump texts. And what I'm really interested in, how we kind of move that to more showing, and obviously in more modern texts, you have a lot more showing of world building. And the way to do that is by linking it to plot and character development. So as the plot or the character develops, if the world building is part of that, to bring it into those elements to show how it impacts on the plot, or how it impacts on the character. And by using things like action and dialogue, conversation, whatever it might be, to show how that world links into those elements. An example might be Jurassic Park, which is the film, not the book. I haven't read the book, actually. I need to read that one at some point. But the film in Jurassic Park, when it has to describe the science of how they've created dinosaurs again, it's part of the tour. It's part of the tour, and they all sit down, and amongst them are scientists, but also amongst them is a lawyer who knows nothing. And so you can get all the dumb questions from the lawyer, which we get at normal times anyway. The so you get that kind of natural space, and I think this is a thing. Someone mentioned to me recently. I haven't watched Alien Earth yet. I don't know if you've been watching it, but someone mentioned Alien Earth to me recently and said there's a scene at the beginning where some in one of the first early episodes where someone literally just tells you the person what the corporations are and what this is and what that is and all the rest of it, and just describes it. And it's really unnatural. Like, you just know it's not part of the plot. It's not part of the. It's just a space in which that person can tell the other person what information the reader or the viewer needs to know. Whereas in Jurassic Park example, you've got an example of it feels like it's part of the plot because they're on a tour, and you're in a park where this is happening, and it's part of the entertainment almost. So it makes sense in that space, and so it's thinking about how the world is exposed in a way that's natural, that's contributing to plot and character, not necessarily separate to those things. And so in terms of levels of importance, I think for the genre, it's of supreme importance, but it's part of that, that circle of things that you need to make work in a piece of work.
How do you make it work in short fiction, though? I mean, with a novel length story, you got time to do some exposition, but do it in a natural way through the characters without having to front load it all. How do you manage that in fiction? And does writing speculative fiction with having just that one element different make it easier to manage?
It definitely doesn't make it easier. So that this is why I suppose my PhD. This is why I'm really interested in it. Is that I don't think there's much written about short fiction specifically, and I think you have a very different constraints in short fiction. Firstly, obviously, the space, you don't have the space to necessarily have long, reams of text talking about what the world is like and how it works and all the rest of it. And you mentioned Suvan earlier, but Suvan talks about estrangement. And so this idea that, you're introducing a world and you're estranging the reader from the real world into this other world, that takes time. I don't think a lot of short fiction doesn't just have one change. My favorite author is Ted Chiang, who only writes short fiction. He's only had two books published in short fiction. And in many of his, there are multiple things that are changing. The whole world is very different, and he manages to keep his stories quite concise. But the way that's done is by keeping to those rules of ensuring that the changes are part of the description of the changes, or the exposition of the changes in this fictional world are described through the plot and the characters, the development of the plot, development of the characters, and ensuring that it's part of their journey and their story. So, for example, his most famous short story, Stories of Our Lives, which is the film Arrival, if you've ever seen that, is based on that short story. You're learning the language of the aliens with the linguist who's going to kind of try to work it out. And so it's central to the plot. For most of that story, the quest that the protagonist is on is to understand the alien language. And so you learning about it, you're learning it as the person themselves, the protagonist themselves is learning about it. It's directly tied. The world building is directly tied to the plot and what's happening. And also, eventually, we find out for a character as well. It's the development of the character and the worldview of the character that is impacted so greatly in that story. So yeah, that's the trick. I can't say I'm an expert. I don't say that when I know that there's writers out there who do an amazing job of you creating short stories with these really interesting worlds that have, not only a novum, but many other differences in the world, in that fictional world, that they explore and develop really well and explain really well. But it's using those modes that allow you to so if it's just a stack of text which tells us this is why this is like this, or this is what is different here, that feels unnatural. It disconnects us from that world. But if it's part of the action, if it's part of the plot, if it's part of the character development, if it's part of the inner thoughts, and if it's part of the dialogue that's happening and it's natural dialogue, then that is what helps enable that world to be kind of developed and the reader to engage in that world.
I think as writers, we tend to make use of tropes and schemas that already exist. So, for instance, I don't have to explain to someone reading a fantasy book what a dragon is, or what a griffin is, or what an elf looks like, because we've already got schemas now for those things within popular culture. Same for spaceships, time travel machines. People generally get the idea. This is a time traveling machine. This is what makes it different from other time traveling machines, but we know what it does. You don't have to explain. When I push this button, it will take us back to 1946. It's just something that we come to accept. And I think that helps as a shortcut in world building, that you can rely on them, even though they're fantastical elements. We can rely on the reader to understand what those things are. Um, so I think those shortcuts form a part of how we write. Before we finish, can you give us an idea of what your writing rituals are and what your you know things that you do in preparation of your writing and how you write?
Yeah, I have. Maybe this is why I'm not like a successful published writer yet. I've had some small successes, and I'm still on that journey to becoming a writer. I think um, I've in my kind of time of working on my writing, I've had times where I'm disciplined and following kind of good routines which really work, and there's times when I'm not so disciplined and not so fantastic in terms of keeping to good routines. When I say my good routines are when I my rituals and my kind of the things that I do when I'm in a good space. Um, I like to write in the morning. I like to write first thing, um, and ideally, it's when I if I can wake up, get out of bed, wash my face, get ready, and not even get ready properly, just kind of wash my face, you know, do a morning wash, and then kind of get to writing early on as soon as possible. This might be before the morning prayer, so pray in the morning at sunrise or just before sunrise. So before the morning prayer, if I can get an hour or two in, that'd be fantastic. And oftentimes that's when you get the best. For me, when I get the best kind of writing done. I can't remember who it is, but someone has mentioned something similar and said it's almost like you're still in that dream state, and your imagination can just go wherever it wants, and the writing is more vivid and fluid. And I found that when I write at that time, that often works really well for me. Um, Other than that, in terms of, I think especially in science fiction and possibly similar in fantasy, writing is a lot around about ideas, and it's the ideas that you develop. And for me, I don't kind of get an idea and go, I'm going to write that straight away. I mull over it for a while, and I'm sure many ideas disappear, and I never looked at again or never thought about again. But some ideas stick and keep coming back and keep demanding to be written about, and they exist in my mind for a long time and allow me to kind of really think about them, not not forcing myself to think about them, but just as they come up, I can explore them, think them through, and then when I come to writing it, it might be an idea that I've had for quite some time. Then I'm able to kind of really go into it much more deeper on an initial run. I tend to write quickly, so with a short story, I can write it over a weekend or over a couple of days. I write quickly in that sense. First draft, it's usually terrible. I need to work on it a lot and edit it a lot to get it to anywhere near good enough to be able to to be good. And sometimes it's always terrible, and so other times it just needs a lot of work. But once it's there, it's ready. I definitely find editing much harder than writing. Writing, I feel I can just do and develop an idea, develop a plot, develop characters, and there's a good semblance of what's going on. But the editing section part of it is much I find much more difficult.
Okay, thank you very much, Jazakallah, for joining me today, Ismail.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. So thank you once again for listening. Please do not forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. The podcast needs your support to get more guests like Ismail, like Adrian Tchaikovsky, and Asmit Spark. And until next time, keep dreaming, keep writing, and let your story shine.